Today, as we continue to study the book of Psalms, we are going to look at the longest psalm in the book. And this is Psalm 119 or 118 in the Septuagint numbering. Psalm 119 is 176 verses long. So you might not know all of Psalm 119, but you do know some of it. If you've ever been to a Christian bookstore and you saw a poster or a fridge magnet or a bookmark that said, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path," that's Psalm 119, verse 105. The very first thing the deacon says in the liturgy, "It is time for the Lord to act," is Psalm 119, verse 126. And if you've ever been to an Orthodox funeral service, or if you've been to Vespers, then you also know Psalm 119, verse 12, which is, "Blessed are you, O Lord, teach me your statutes." There are so many verses to this psalm, but the message, though, is very simple. And it actually is summed up in that verse 12, "Blessed are you, Lord, teach me your statutes." This is a celebration of God's law. So this is 176 different ways of saying that the law of God has to be at the center of a believer's life. Now, when we talk about the law of God, when we talk about God's precepts, that can seem so expansive. So many things to get straight, layers upon layers of teachings. But we can streamline these things very easily. In fact, Jesus does this for us in the Gospels. People come up to him and say, "Of all of those precepts and teachings, what's the most important commandment?" And Jesus responds with two commandments. From Deuteronomy chapter 6, Jesus says, "The first and greatest commandment is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." And the second commandment is from Leviticus chapter 18, "Love your neighbor as yourself." Now, whenever I talk about this second commandment, I feel it important to make a point. It's very, very important. We often translate, or we often think that that second commandment is, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself." That's not what it says. It says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." In other words, we have to look at our neighbors as extensions of ourselves, that their lives are extensions of our own lives. Their being is intimately connected to our being. That's what that second commandment says. Everything Jesus says in the law and the prophets, everything else in scriptures rests upon these two commandments. Love God and love your neighbor. Now today in the Orthodox Church is the Sunday of the Last Judgment. It's 2 Sundays before the beginning of Lent. We just heard Matthew 25, Jesus teaching on the final judgment. And in this teaching, Jesus demonstrates for us how the commandments to love God and love your neighbor play out in real-world situations. "I was hungry and you fed me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was sick and in prison, you visited me." And he says, "Inasmuch as you did this to the least of my brethren, you did it to me." So how this connects to the two great commandments is that we show our love for God ultimately by showing our love for our neighbors in concrete ways. We can look at our faith and it looks very difficult and complicated. You know, all this history and all these books we have to read and everything. Everything circles around to the commandments to love God and love your neighbor. Now, during Great Lent, we're called to take some time to study our faith. That's the original purpose of Lent. It was to give the catechumens, those preparing for baptism, their final instructions before being received into the church. Matthew 25 puts all of this into perspective. All of the scriptures, all the teachings of the fathers, all the various liturgical celebrations and seasons, everything that we do informs us and just simply forms us to help us to fulfill these two simple but great commandments: love God and love your neighbor. So if we're going to do what we do in Psalm 119, if we are going to immerse ourselves in God's statutes, if we are going to wrap ourselves in the law of God, we need to understand that what we are really doing is making a commitment to love. That's what we're doing. And just like Psalm 119 and all those 176 verses keep circling back to the law of God, the life of a Christian keeps circling back to the two great commandments, keeps circling back to the choice to love through concrete acts of service and kindness and compassion, just like God loves us, without conditions and without limits.